It began as a hushed conversation behind palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Catherine, Princess of Wales's face, as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something had shifted. Something irreversible. And at the center of it all was a document no one was supposed to see until now. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The meeting itself, according to those who quietly orbit the inner machinery of the monarchy, was never meant to attract attention. It was scheduled discreetly, tucked into a corner of the day where even seasoned royal watchers would struggle to notice. Inside the room sat King Charles III, visibly wearied yet resolute, alongside Prince William, whose silence reportedly spoke louder than any words exchanged. Senior advisors were present, two figures rarely named, yet always felt custodians of protocol, guardians of precedent, and, on this occasion, witnesses to something far more consequential than routine governance. Reports suggest that what unfolded behind those closed doors was not simply a discussion, but a quiet execution of authority. A palace order, as insiders have begun to call it in hushed tones, was introduced, its language precise, its implications vast. It was not read aloud in full, not debated in any conventional sense. Instead, it was acknowledged with the kind of gravity that signals inevitability. Those familiar with royal administrative structures whisper that such documents are rarely spontaneous. They are crafted over weeks, sometimes months, refined in secrecy, and unveiled only when the moment is deemed unavoidable. What made this moment different, however, was the atmosphere that followed. Staff were instructed firmly, unusually, to maintain absolute silence. No briefings. No clarifications. Not even the subtle leaks that typically accompany internal shifts were permitted. It was, as one insider phrased it, a vacuum of information so deliberate it became its own message. And then there was Catherine herself. She emerged not with panic, not with visible distress, but with a composure that seemed almost too controlled, as if the weight she carried had already settled deep within her before she stepped back into the public eye. Later that evening, separate briefings reportedly took place. William, according to multiple sources, was seen engaging in a quieter, more focused discussion, one that centered not on what had been signed, but on what would come next. Enforcement. Implementation. Consequence. Words that rarely surface in the softer narratives of royal life, yet suddenly felt unavoidable. Insiders claim there had been signs, subtle, almost imperceptible, that something was building. A shift in tone. A tightening of control. A sense that the monarchy was preparing, quietly, for a recalibration. And now, with the existence of this document no longer entirely hidden, those earlier whispers have begun to align into something far more coherent and far more unsettling. Because this was never just about a meeting, or even a single decision. It was about a structure being reshaped from within, guided by forces that understood both the fragility and the enduring power of the crown. But the truth behind that document wasn't just administrative, it carried the weight of a centuries-old power struggle, one that had finally reached its breaking point. The document itself was deceptively simple, a formal decree signed in silence. But those who understood the inner workings of the monarchy knew instantly this was no ordinary order. This was a shift in power, a recalibration of authority that placed Catherine, Princess of Wales, in a role no modern royal had ever held. At first glance, the language of the order appeared restrained, almost cautious, as if designed to avoid drawing attention. Yet those familiar with palace protocol quickly recognized the weight hidden between its lines. The title alone, Supreme Family Representative, was unlike anything seen in recent royal memory. It did not merely suggest influence, it implied oversight. Not symbolic presence, but operational authority. And in a system where hierarchy has always been carefully preserved, even the smallest adjustment can signal a much larger transformation unfolding beneath the surface. Insiders whisper that the structure of this role borrows fragments from the past, echoing quiet mechanisms once associated with Queen Elizabeth II's long reign. During moments of uncertainty, there were always figures entrusted with maintaining balance behind-the-scenes individuals who ensured continuity when the crown itself faced pressure. But never before had such responsibility been formalized in this way, and certainly not assigned so clearly to a single individual positioned just one step below the sovereign. That distinction alone has raised questions among those who understand how carefully the monarchy guards its internal equilibrium. The legal framework supporting the order only deepens the intrigue. References to letters patent those rare and powerful instruments that define authority within the royal institution, suggest that this was not a temporary measure. It was embedded into the system itself, reinforced by internal governance structures that leave little room for ambiguity. Those familiar with these mechanisms describe them as self-sustaining, meaning once activated, they operate with a momentum that is difficult, if not impossible, to reverse without significant consequence. And that, perhaps, is what makes this development so extraordinary. What has unsettled many observers, however, is how this role appears to move beyond traditional lines of seniority. The monarchy has long functioned on a delicate balance of rank, experience, and inherited position. Yet this order seems to sidestep those conventions, placing Catherine in a position that allows her to influence decisions not only in public-facing duties, but also in private family matters, areas that have historically remained shielded from formal intervention. Engagements, disputes, internal coordination, suddenly, all of it may pass through a single point of authority. Early commentary from royal correspondents such as Robert Hardman has only added to the sense that something profound is taking place. While no official statement has fully explained the scope of the role, the tone of these early analyses suggests that this is being viewed not as a temporary adjustment, but as a defining moment in the evolution of the modern monarchy. A moment where tradition bends, not breaks, but bends just enough to allow something new to emerge. And yet, as the implications begin to settle, another reality starts to surface. Because in a system where power is never created without consequence, elevation inevitably casts a shadow elsewhere. And while Catherine's rise may appear measured and necessary, it also disrupts a balance that others have spent years carefully building. But if this order elevated Catherine, it also threatened someone else, someone who had quietly built influence behind the scenes for years. Long before the order was signed, tensions had been simmering beneath the polished surface of royal life. Glances lingered too long, conversations ended too quickly, and in the corridors of power, one name kept surfacing: Queen Camilla. What made these tensions so difficult to trace was not their visibility, but their subtlety. Nothing openly fractured, nothing publicly collapsed. Instead, according to those who quietly observe the rhythms of palace life, the strain revealed itself in moments that seemed insignificant on the surface: altered guest lists, delayed confirmations, the quiet reshuffling of influence behind carefully curated appearances. It was not confrontation in the traditional sense. It was something far more controlled, far more deliberate. A slow, almost imperceptible contest of presence and authority. Reports suggest that disagreements between Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Camilla were never direct, never openly acknowledged, yet deeply felt within the structure of royal operations. Different interpretations of internal meetings describe a contrast not just in personality, but in philosophy. Catherine, grounded in discipline and long-term continuity. Camilla, shaped by years of navigating complex social landscapes, exercising influence through connection, familiarity, and carefully maintained alliances. Two approaches. Two visions. And increasingly, no clear space for both to exist without friction. Insiders whisper that Camilla's influence extended far beyond ceremonial duties. Her reach into domestic royal affairs, particularly in the coordination of private gatherings, patronage alignments, and social engagements, had, over time, created a network of quiet authority. It was not codified, not written into formal structure, but it was understood, respected, and in some cases relied upon. That influence, however, began to face subtle resistance. Invitations shifted, priorities realigned. Certain decisions, once assumed to fall naturally within her domain, were no longer as predictable as they once had been. Those familiar with the internal dynamics suggest that these changes were not accidental. They point to a gradual repositioning, one that seemed to place Catherine closer to the center of operational stability. Not loudly, not abruptly, but steadily. Her presence became more consistent in discussions that shaped the direction of engagements and public representation. Her voice, once measured and supportive, began to carry a different kind of weight, one that signaled trust not just from Prince William, but increasingly from the institution itself. At the center of it all stood King Charles III, a figure caught in a quiet but unmistakable dilemma. Loyalty, on one side, legacy, on the other. Reports indicate that his position became more complicated as these undercurrents intensified. Because every shift, every adjustment, carried implications not just for the present, but for the future shape of the monarchy. And in moments of uncertainty, the crown has always sought stability above all else. Early signs suggested that Catherine was being positioned not as a challenger, but as a solution. A stabilizing force in a system that could no longer rely solely on informal balances of power. But stability, in an environment already under strain, often comes at a cost. Because to elevate one position is, inevitably, to unsettle another. And so the tension, once contained within whispers and quiet adjustments, began to reach a point where silence was no longer sustainable. The balance was shifting. The lines were being redrawn. And those who had sensed it all along were now watching closely, waiting for the moment when the quiet struggle would finally become something undeniable. And then, almost without warning, the quiet tension turned into something far more decisive, a move that would redefine the balance of power entirely. When King Charles III finally acted, he did so with the weight of history behind him. There were no public speeches, no grand announcements, just a signature deliberate, calculated, and impossible to reverse. Those closest to the inner workings of the monarchy suggest that this moment had been building quietly for far longer than anyone outside the palace could have realized. It was not born out of impulse, nor was it the result of a single disagreement. Instead, it emerged from a growing awareness, one shaped by time, pressure, and the undeniable reality of a changing institution. Reports indicate that Charles, already navigating the physical toll of ongoing health concerns, had reached a point where hesitation was no longer an option. The crown, as it has always demanded, required clarity. And clarity, in this case, required action. There is a certain gravity that comes with decisions made under such circumstances, not rushed, but accelerated by necessity. Insiders whisper that the king's perspective had shifted in recent months, becoming more focused, more intentional, as if guided by a deeper understanding of what must endure beyond his own reign. The monarchy, after all, is not designed to pause. It must adapt, even when adaptation feels uncomfortable. And in moments where uncertainty threatens stability, authority must be concentrated, not scattered. That urgency appears to have shaped the choice that followed. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was not simply selected, she was positioned. Elevated not for symbolism, but for function. Those familiar with her role within the family describe her as a figure of balance, someone who operates with restraint, yet commands quiet respect. In a system where perception and reality often blur, she has maintained a consistency that few can replicate. And perhaps that is why, when the time came to reinforce the structure of the monarchy, her name rose above all others. The activation of the palace order itself was handled with the kind of precision that defines royal governance. There were no leaks in advance, no gradual unveiling. Instead, it was introduced internally, supported by the legal weight of established frameworks, letters patent, internal directives, and the unspoken authority of the Crown's institutional memory. Once signed, it moved swiftly into effect, embedding itself into the operational flow of the royal household. Those who understand these mechanisms often describe them as self-enforcing, designed to function seamlessly once initiated. Yet no decision of this magnitude exists in isolation. Behind the scenes, Prince William is said to have played a critical role not in shaping the order itself, but in ensuring its stability once enacted. His position, both as heir and as a central figure within the modern monarchy, allowed him to reinforce the decision in ways that extended beyond formal authority. Together, their alignment created something far more significant than a simple appointment. It created a unified front, one that signaled continuity in a time where uncertainty had begun to surface. And perhaps most telling of all is what this move reveals about Charles's broader vision. This was not merely a response to immediate pressures, it was a statement quiet, controlled, but unmistakable about the future direction of the monarchy. A future where stability is prioritized over tradition when necessary, and where the preservation of the institution takes precedence over personal dynamics. But while the king's decision was final on paper, its real impact would only be felt once the new authority was put to the test. The reaction was immediate and far from quiet. Behind closed doors, alliances shifted, loyalties were questioned, and the very structure of the royal household seemed to tremble under the weight of what had just been set in motion. What had once been managed through quiet understanding and unspoken hierarchy now felt exposed, almost fragile, as if the carefully maintained balance inside the monarchy had been disrupted in a single stroke. Reports suggest that senior aides, those who had long operated as the silent architects of royal continuity, were among the first to feel the shift. Conversations that once flowed with certainty became measured, cautious. Decisions that once followed familiar patterns suddenly required reconsideration. It was not chaos, but it was unmistakably unsettled. Within the extended family, the response carried a different kind of intensity. Insiders whisper that the announcement did not land evenly. For some, it represented clarity, a long-awaited step toward stability. For others, it felt abrupt, even disorienting. Nowhere was that sense of disruption more evident than within the circle surrounding Queen Camilla. Those familiar with her network describe a reaction that bordered on disbelief, not loud, not public, but deeply felt. The word blindsided has surfaced repeatedly in quiet accounts, suggesting that whatever preparations had been made for this transition, they had not extended to everyone who would be affected by it. And as the initial shock settled into something more calculated, the real consequences began to emerge. Control over engagements once dispersed across various channels started to consolidate. Scheduling authority shifted subtly but decisively, with approvals now flowing through a more centralized structure. Invitations, appearances, internal coordination, each element began to reflect a new order, one where oversight was no longer assumed, but defined. Those accustomed to navigating the old system found themselves adjusting, recalibrating, learning the contours of a structure that felt both unfamiliar and inevitable. Beyond the palace walls, the reaction took on a different form. Media speculation intensified, with publications such as The Times and Tatler beginning to piece together the implications of what had occurred. While official statements remained measured, even restrained, the tone of external analysis suggested something far more significant, a recognition that this was not simply an internal adjustment, but a defining moment in the evolution of the monarchy. A moment where the balance between tradition and transformation was no longer theoretical, but actively unfolding. Public perception, too, began to shift, though not in the dramatic bursts that often accompany royal headlines. Instead, it moved gradually, almost imperceptibly, as attention turned toward Catherine, Princess of Wales. Her composure, her consistency, her quiet authority, all of it began to resonate in a new way, not as a supporting presence, but as a central figure. a point of stability in a system that had just undergone a profound recalibration. And with that shift came something deeper, something more enduring. The monarchy itself, long defined by its ability to adapt without appearing to change, had entered a new phase one, marked by a clearer, more centralized form of control. It was not a break from tradition, but a tightening of it. A refinement. A signal that, in times of uncertainty, the institution would not hesitate to redefine its own boundaries in order to protect its future. Yet even as the dust began to settle, one question lingered: what would this new order mean for the future of the crown itself? For Catherine, Princess of Wales, this was never about power, it was about responsibility. But as the weight of her new role settled in, it became clear that she was now the linchpin holding the modern monarchy together. What makes this transformation so compelling is not its suddenness, but its inevitability. For years, Catherine had been defined by restraint measured in her words, precise in her actions, unwavering in her commitment to protocol. She was, as many observers quietly noted, the embodiment of continuity in a system that thrives on discipline. Yet beneath that calm exterior, there had always been something more, a quiet resilience, a capacity to absorb pressure without allowing it to fracture her composure. And now, with the full force of her new role taking shape, that resilience was no longer operating in the background, it had moved to the very center of the monarchy's survival. Reports suggest that her transition from a supportive presence to a central authority figure did not unfold through dramatic declarations or visible shifts. Instead, it emerged through consistency, through the quiet assumption of responsibility where others hesitated, through the steady management of duties that, piece by piece, began to redefine her position. What had once been interpreted as grace under pressure was now understood as something far more strategic, a deliberate alignment with the long-term needs of the institution itself. Public perception has followed this shift with a kind of growing intensity. Admiration, once rooted in relatability and warmth, has taken on a sharper edge. It is no longer just about who she is, but what she represents. Stability, continuity, a sense of order in a moment where uncertainty had begun to ripple through the royal structure. Yet with that admiration comes scrutiny and unrelenting attention to every decision, every movement, every silence. Because when someone becomes central to an institution as historic as the monarchy, they are no longer observed casually, they are measured. At her side, Prince William remains a constant force, not overshadowing her rise, but reinforcing it. Their partnership, often described as seamless, now carries a deeper significance. It is not just a union of roles, but a consolidation of purpose. Together, they represent a shift toward a more unified approach to leadership, one that balances tradition with the demands of a changing world. And in that unity, there is strength. A sense that the monarchy is not drifting, but deliberately steering itself forward. Comparisons to Queen Elizabeth II have begun to surface more frequently, though often in careful tones. Not as direct parallels, but as echoes. Moments where Catherine's composure, her ability to endure pressure without visible strain, recalls the early years of a reign that would come to define an era. It is not about replacing history, but about continuing it, adapting its lessons to a new context, a new generation, a new set of challenges. And that perhaps is what makes this moment so significant. It is not just about one individual stepping into a role. It is about what that role represents, a turning point where the monarchy begins to place its future in the hands of those who will carry it forward. A quiet but unmistakable acknowledgement that time does not stand still, and neither can the institution it governs. But even the strongest foundations can be tested, and the true measure of this new role was still to come. What had begun as a single signature was now reshaping an institution centuries in the making. The monarchy was no longer operating as it once had, and those who understood its inner workings knew there was no going back. The shift was not loud, not immediate, but it was undeniable. Beneath the surface of ceremony and tradition, the internal structure of the royal household began to realign itself with quiet precision. Roles that had once overlapped now appeared more clearly defined. Lines of authority, previously guided by custom and familiarity, were being redrawn with intent. According to those who follow these developments closely, this was not a dismantling of tradition, but a tightening of it. A move toward clarity in a system that had, for years, relied on unwritten understanding. One of the most striking consequences of this transition has been the gradual fading of informal power networks. These networks, often built through years of personal relationships and social influence, had long played a subtle yet significant role in shaping decisions behind the scenes. But as the new structure took hold, their influence appeared to diminish. Not abruptly, not confrontationally, but steadily. Authority was no longer something that could be assumed through proximity or familiarity. It was being anchored in defined roles, reinforced by a system that prioritized accountability over ambiguity. At the center of this transformation stands Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose role now reflects a broader shift towards streamlined, duty-focused leadership. What once might have been distributed across multiple figures is now increasingly consolidated, creating a model that emphasizes consistency over complexity. This is not about concentrating power for its own sake, but about ensuring that the monarchy operates with a clarity that matches the demands of the present moment. In a world that moves faster than tradition alone can accommodate, adaptation becomes not just necessary, but inevitable. This evolution also aligns with a longer arc that has been quietly unfolding within the institution. For years, there have been discussions, sometimes public, often private, about modernization, about the need to balance heritage with relevance. And while those conversations rarely produce immediate results, they lay the groundwork for moments like this. Moments where change, once theoretical, becomes tangible. Where the monarchy does not abandon its past, but reshapes it in order to endure. The implications of this shift extend beyond the present, reaching into the future of the royal family itself. Younger members, those who will one day carry the weight of the crown, are now observing a different model of leadership, one defined less by tradition alone and more by function, responsibility, and adaptability. This could influence not just how they approach their roles, but how the institution continues to evolve in the years to come. Because every structural change leaves an imprint, shaping the expectations of those who follow. And perhaps that is the most profound aspect of all. This is not simply a response to immediate pressures or internal tensions. It is a recalibration designed to ensure survival in a world that no longer accepts tradition without question. The monarchy, as it has done throughout its history, is adapting not by abandoning its identity, but by refining it. And as this new chapter unfolded, one final truth began to emerge, one that would define the legacy of everyone involved. In the end, it was never just about titles or authority. It was about legacy, the kind that outlives individuals and shapes history itself. And with one decisive move, King Charles III may have ensured exactly that. What began as a quiet shift within palace walls has now revealed itself as something far more enduring. The decision to name Catherine, Princess of Wales, as the supreme family representative was never simply about the present moment. It was about securing the future of an institution that has survived by adapting when it mattered most. Reports suggest that this move was carefully considered, not just as a solution to immediate tensions, but as a long-term recalibration of how authority flows within the monarchy. It reflects an understanding that legacy is not preserved through hesitation, but through decisive, often difficult action. At its core, the monarchy has always been more than a collection of individuals. It is a system, a symbol, a sacred trust carried across generations. And within that framework, personal dynamics, no matter how complex, must ultimately yield to the greater purpose of continuity. Insiders whisper that this principle guided Charles in his final act of control amid uncertainty. Faced with internal strain and the weight of his own limitations, he did not retreat. Instead, he acted with a clarity that suggests a deeper awareness of what the crown demands when stability is at risk. For Catherine, this moment represents both an elevation and a burden. Her role is no longer defined by proximity to the future, it is defined by responsibility for it. Every decision, every action, now carries implications that extend beyond her own position. She is not simply participating in the monarchy's evolution, she is helping to shape it. And in doing so, she becomes a bridge between what has been and what must come next. A figure tasked with safeguarding not just tradition, but the very relevance of the institution in a rapidly changing world. Yet what makes this transformation so powerful is the balance it seeks to achieve. Tradition is not being discarded, it is being refined, strengthened, aligned with the realities of a new era where visibility, accountability, and purpose matter more than ever. The monarchy, long defined by its ability to endure, is once again proving that endurance is not passive, it is active. It requires adaptation, even when that adaptation challenges long-held expectations. And so, as the dust settles and the implications of this decision continue to unfold, a clearer picture begins to emerge. This was never about reshaping power for its own sake. It was about protecting something far greater, a legacy built over centuries, a system designed to outlast those who serve it. And in that context, every choice, every sacrifice, becomes part of a larger narrative, one that will be judged not by immediate reactions, but by its ability to stand the test of time. Because in the House of Windsor, power may shift, but the crown always remembers who chose duty when it mattered most. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.